Gest sinya kuke lemlem pesia at squext Louis Quest chineslemti. What I said is good afternoon. My name is Angelique Albert. Thank you all for being here today with us for this very special panel on allyship with tribal communities and people. I am thankful. I am thankful. I am a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes from Northwest Montana. I'm a member of the MBK Advisory Board, and I am my brother's keeper. I have to tell you, I was going to just jump into this panel, just straight into this session today, but I was so inspired by President Obama's talk yesterday that I wanted to take a moment just to say a few words. He spoke about equity, movements, change, and particularly when he was talking to Alicia Garza with Black Lives Matter. He stated that, one charismatic leader does not create change, that movements and true change comes through grassroots efforts and collective leadership. And I'm so proud of the work that is being done in this country right now around equity, but I'm also here to tell you, as an Indigenous person, I want to let you know that we are here in this space with you, that we are partners in equity work, and we are allies. For my day job, I'm the Executive Director of American Indian Graduate Center, which is the largest and oldest scholarship provider to Native students in this country. We provide about $350 million to Native students in direct scholarship support. And those students are from 573 federally recognized tribes and 63 state recognized tribes. So why do I introduce my day job to you this way? Is it because I love my job? Yes, 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 I love my job. And as an Indigenous person, I find myself always needing to educate people. I find myself fighting a false narrative and a continued effort to erase my people. The most pervasive form of racism for Native people in this country is invisibility. I'm here to tell you that we are still here. We are among you and we are allies. For myself and many people coming from the hundreds of tribal nations across this country, we know the stories of our ancestors. We know the names of our grandfathers. We know the names of our grandmothers who were resilient against colonization. We know the people who were strong to persevere against a nation that wanted to assimilate and terminate us. We know the story of the United States, who acknowledged our sovereignty through the hundreds of treaties with tribal nations across this country. We are still here. We have been here. We've been here the whole time. We are among you and we're allies. So why is it then that, for example, when the NAACP says that Black and Native people are 3 times more likely to be fatally shot by police officers than their white counterparts, followed by the Latinx community? Why is it that we hear the story of Black and Latinx communities? Invisibility and erasure. This is our struggle. Why do we struggle as a nation to be inclusive of Indigenous people? Why are First People of this continent often left out of the conversations when it comes to equity? I continue to hear the false narrative that we're no longer here, that there's so few of us, that we're like a mythical unicorn that's so rare to find. Today, we are here to tell you that there are hundreds of tribal nations, that there are thousands of Native citizens. We are here, we are among you, we are allies. I believe that lack of knowledge and understanding creates barriers. And today, we all know we're here to break down those barriers and build dreams with you. So we are here to join that equity discussion. We are here to share challenges that exist for our boys and young men. And with the dream of a more equitable society and creating system change, we are here to have a discussion with you. We collectively can partner for more effectively, to work more effectively with our tribal people, our tribal communities, and our tribal nations. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our panelists to join us, and just say that I'm just honored to be among these three distinguished Native men. Dr. Corey Still, who is a member of Sigma Nu Alpha Gamma Incorporated, the Society of Native American Gentlemen. He is also a member of the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians from Oklahoma. We have Sheldon Spotted Elk. He is the Director of Tribal Justice Relations of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. He is a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe, also from Montana, yay. And Eric Stegman, who is the Executive Director of Native Americans in Philanthropy. He is a long-standing partner with MBKA in his previous work with the Center of Native American Youth, and he is a member of Carry the Kettle First Nations Nakota Tribe of Saskatchewan, Canada, which is also just north of Montana. So our neighbor, so welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I am going to start out with, I'd like to ask, I would like to just kind of start the discussion with Dr. Still and Sheldon. I'll ask you the first question with, I know that Dr. Still, you're probably one of the youngest people I know to receive your PhD at the age of 28. And so I know you are very involved with Native youth. And then also Sheldon, you know, with your father of young Indigenous men, and you've been a very active member in making sure that Native youth are involved and engaged and with MBK Rising and other events. But I just wanted to kind of invite both of you to speak a little bit about the challenges that our young men are facing and how this may be similar or different to other young men of color.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and take the first step at this, and I will say I'm feeling the Montana vibes here. So I'm the lone southern tribe out here, I guess. I'll just call that out for my southern brothers and sisters. But again, Osage Nagad, I just want to welcome you all and thank you all for sharing space with us this morning. And you know, as we kind of talk about what are the key challenges that our young men and our young boys are facing and what kind of sets us apart, really what Angelique talked about in the beginning, that idea of invisibility, because that idea of invisibility really does set Native people apart, and especially Native men, because oftentimes we're forgotten. Oftentimes we're not seen to be in mainstream society. We're not seen to be a living people. We're often seen to be static people. We're seen as things in the past. But I think one of the other key differences that we have to talk about, and sometimes we don't think about, is our actual status within American politics. You know, Native people are members of sovereign nations, and so with that we hold extra identities, we hold extra citizenships that really set us apart in how we're to engage. And so when we talk about this from a political perspective or a community perspective, you know, you're also dealing with citizens of another nation. And many times those nations are spread across the United States, and those citizens aren't necessarily inside their jurisdictional boundaries. But for me, those are the two big things, is that, you know, sometimes we don't understand the full context of Native people, especially Native men. And then also we're seen as invisible, we're seen as forgotten, and we're seen as static.
Those are great points. Sheldon?
Thank you, Corey, for sharing that. Pivayishif, Nishawu, Nahistave. So I'm Sheldon Spotted Elk of Northern Cheyenne, from the center of the cradle of the universe in Montana, you know, so it's good to be on here and have this conversation. I'll follow up on what Corey's saying. I do also agree. I think invisibility is something really difficult to navigate for our young people. It was difficult for when I was young. I'm not that young anymore, but back in the day when I was young, I think that was a significant thing. If you're a young Native person that grew up in Indian country like myself, the only time you really see yourself is actually in maybe racist mascots. And so if you go to the city and you want to go to Foot Locker and buy something that is representative of you, it has to be in a mascot form and an objectifying form. I like what Corey was talking about, is oftentimes these images are objectifying. And of course, when you objectify humanity, it is dehumanizing. It undermines us. I think for Native peoples, at one time I'm a lawyer by training, and I represented youth both in juvenile delinquency proceedings and in child welfare proceedings, so kids that are in foster care. If we look at the national data on that, it's actually ×3 on both, actually. And so Native youth are 3 times more likely than the general population, than the white population, to be in foster care. They're 3 times more likely to be arrested as a juvenile. And so we look at some of these troubling data points of systemic involvement. There is a pipeline to prison that exists within Indian country that rarely gets talked about. I'll even say even in our own communities, I feel like sometimes there needs to be more voices. That's a voice that I try to serve as, is to bring this up as much and as often as possible. It impacted family members. It's impacted my best friends that I grew up with. I watched them in some ways. Was fortunate that for a lot of different reasons, being able to get off that pipeline to prison. I've been also really fortunate to be involved with some of the MBK events. And so if we look back at, I was fortunate enough to go down with Tiger Scalp Crane from Northern Cheyenne. We brought 5 young people from the Northern Cheyenne tribe. And if you look at that group right there, there's one of those kids is actually took his own life, and so we look at that as just suicide as a significant thing. Some of that is part of invisibility. I apologize. But some of that is invisibility. Some of that is just all these risk factors that are looked at, and the pressure that young people feel and not being seen. So I think there are some significant things that need to happen for us. And I think oftentimes, and I just recently saw somebody quote this, and so it's not my own quote here, but just I think in some ways I'm tired of hearing our community being they're being called resilient. Because that kind of means you're really good at taking a punch. You're really good at taking a punch and staying on your feet, and I want to thrive. And I know in my life, in my experience, and in my culture, you thrive when there's connection. You thrive when there's people around you that love you, and you're able to form connection, and you're able to give love and receive love at the same time. That solves a lot of our human problems, actually, when we exist within a tribe, within a community, a loving community. And so ways that we can promote that. I saw one of the quotes on this is, if you want to go fast, you go by yourself. You want to go far, you go together, so there is a need for collaboration. There's a need for allyship. We want to be invited to the party, and we want to invite you to our party too. So you'll never experience hospitality like Native hospitality. It's the best in the world, I promise you that. So we have the best hospitality. You're never going to see love like that, like you see in tribal communities. I say the last thing I'll add is that I feel like there's so much significance that tribal communities can teach the world right now. And one area is environmentalism. I feel like those that followed Standing Rock, that was a youth movement. You look at what that did and how the whole world looked at that. So we could teach the world about environmentalism, about loving the land. And the other things we could teach the world about is love, is kinship love, is family love. And so I think our tribal communities have those 2 great contributions, among other things. I'm Northern Cheyenne. We killed Custer. We killed General Custer. So that was our great contribution, but we have more contributions to give. So, so that's my answer to the question.
Oh my gosh. And so powerful, both of you. I love the points that you made about just making sure that we're recognized not just as a racial community, but as nations, right? As sovereign nations within this nation. And so I think that's a powerful point. But also, you know, when you talk about the foster care system, pipeline to prison, and all of that, these are similarities, right, that we see with our Black and brown brothers and sisters. You know, we see that correlation and there's strength when there's unity, but also some of those other differences. You know, our suicide rates are so much higher, and that is that's heart-wrenching. You know, I was at MBK Rising, you know, with all of those young men, and just to know, you know, the impact of what's going on in our communities. But love your message of love and sharing our strengths with each other. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move to Eric now. And I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about how does this work? You know, when we talk about MBK and the work that we've been doing, I know you've been involved and a partner in this for a long time, but how do you see this work looking different for us as tribal communities?
Well, thanks so much for having me today, Angelique. It's really an honor to be here with everyone. And there's a lot of things I've learned over the years, I think, in this work. I started my career as a youth organizer myself. I grew up working with a lot of issues on the ground there, and then came out too. So I was a gay man at 16, did a lot of queer youth organizing around Washington State. So I care deeply about organizing. And one of the things, you know, we're really good in Indian country at spitting out lawyers, because one of the things, like my grandfather taught me, is that we need lawyers to protect the treaties. So I did my duty and went to law school. But a lot of the work that I got involved in early on was in the domestic violence space. I did a lot of work with tribal courts, mostly in the Southwest, working at the intersection of where our tribal court leaders have to deal with some of the hardest issues that confront our community, including things like the suicide crisis and a lot of other issues. But what I learned out of that was that there are so many challenges that came out of all of these intentional policies over generations that were designed by the federal government to destroy our families, our culture, and our communities. My great-grandfather went to a boarding school where he was removed from his family and not allowed to practice his culture and speak his language. And that's the story of too many of our relatives out there in Indian country. And it's really easy, I think, for all of us to focus on that a lot, because there's a lot of trauma and harm. But in working with youth leaders, particularly over the last many years, I just resonate so much with what Sheldon was saying. They're finding ways to not just reconnect with our culture, to listen to those elders, but to also, I think, when we're talking about young men, help them find purpose through their culture. You know, so much of the work with MBK and really trying to empower young men across the country from communities of color and other marginalized communities all over the country is actually really about purpose. And one of the things that we did a lot of when I was at Center for Native American Youth, and we worked with Sheldon and a lot of his team on a lot of this work, is to think about how do we bring young people, including young men, together from other communities of color to learn about how culture is integrated in our life. Where do we come from? How do our elders support us and give us strength? There's so many different things that we started to see a lot of younger men in other communities start to really not just learn about, but to actually realize they had their own cultural power in their communities. And I think, you know, when you looked at things like Standing Rock and a lot of these other movements that were inviting other organizers and young people in, they were coming back from those experiences, both with new relationships in our communities, but then also this very different understanding of their own purpose in our world. And so I hope that as we move forward in our work in these networks like MBK, you know, we can really help continue to give our young people that power to really walk in those footsteps of their ancestors and bring others with them, because I think there's a lot that can get past this resilience frame and really help us get back to where we should have been before a lot of this really damaging policy work happened over the past many generations.
Thank you, Eric. I feel like there's so much that you just said to us. And for those listeners, I don't know, I know that within our tribal communities, we know what you mean when you say boarding school era, right? When you're talking about the boarding school, and that's impacted all of us. You know, it impacted my grandfather as well, but it's not something that happened a long time ago. When you're talking about, you know, policies, this is something that impacted my mother's generation, right? And these traumas are so fresh, and we're trying to recover from them. But also when you talk about jurisdictional issues, you know, there are jurisdictional issues when it comes to crimes that happen in Indian country that come to accountability. And so I just appreciate you sharing all of that, and then bringing it back to, of course, the power of culture and connection, and our youth that are really leading those changes in that grassroots kind of work that they're so good at doing, and inspiring us, right? Like Sheldon said, with the pipeline. I can't, my mind just kind of, I lost the name of it, but you know, just joining those movements and joining in with our youth. But this is a question I'm going to shift now to all of you, and I want to know, you know, I feel like us collectively, as communities, that we are not being included. So how do we, as MBK communities, how do we keep tribal communities engaged? So I know that we feel like we keep failing in some sense, right, to connect in a true, meaningful way with tribal people, with tribal communities, and tribal nations. So what can we do as our MBK communities to help change that? And what different approaches can we have? And I kind of just wanted to get any thoughts that you have and advice for our MBK communities out there. Like, what can we do to be doing a better job to engage with our tribes and tribal people? So I'll turn that over to Dr. Still.
I think the first thing, and really this comes from the aspect of listening. And what I mean by listening is not just going into communities and being there, but when we share story, we do that in a way that makes us vulnerable. And there's a concept that's called being story ready. And that concept really focuses more on the listener, to say, listen, when you're going in and you're sharing stories and you're listening to these stories of these communities, and you're listening to these stories of these young men, you've got to prepare yourself. You can't just go in there and just be like, okay, just blindly go in and think that you know what the best practices, think that you know the best methods. You've got to prepare yourself to go in and change your mindset and listen to what they're saying. You know, when I did my research focused entirely on Native men, and I worked with Native college men from across the country. And that was the thing, when we were story ready and we came in to listen, we didn't come in having a agenda of, okay, this is what we're going to research, or this is what we're looking for. We were ready to listen, and their stories unfolded, their needs, their wants, their dreams, their fears. All those things came to pass, and they became vulnerable to a point where they shared things that they even said, I've never shared these things in other spaces before, because I didn't feel like I was seen. I didn't feel like I was heard. I didn't feel like I was valued. And so when we talk about how have we failed tribal communities, or how have we failed tribal people, really we talk about, we listen all the time, but are we truly story ready to listen? Have we truly prepared ourselves as community engagement folks, as activists, as supporters, as fellow men, as fellow sisters, as mothers, as aunties, as uncles? Are we going into that in the right way, that we're ready to actually listen and not assume that we know what's already going to be said? So for me, that would be one of my big key advices.
I love it. I love it. Really honoring the stories You know, I feel like I do my part to educate myself about our Black brothers and sisters. So really understanding their stories from their perspective. So that's I love hearing that, really honoring our stories as Indigenous people. I'll invite Eric and Sheldon.
I'll jump in if that's okay. Thank you, Dr. Corey. I agree with what you had to say. I feel like it's not in this work, this adaptive work that we're doing, you know, changing hearts and minds. It is story. It's art that changes hearts and minds. You know, it's not research papers necessarily. You know, it's a song. You know, it's a story. And so I think there is a practice, and this is what I do a lot of training with judges and lawyers, and there's cross-cultural dialogue. And one of the big principles that I try to train on all the time, and it's I need to practice this as much as everybody else, is this aspect of cultural humility. And when you're culturally humble, you're at a listen first disposition. Indian country is unique in the sense that only 1 out of 4 of us live on a reservation. So most of us, like me, I live in Denver, Colorado. You know, I live off my reservation, away from the homelands in Montana. To say that one more time. And so there's a dynamic of working with inner city youth that you might not have thought they were like, oh, we didn't know we had Native people that lived in Denver City. And so being able to help raise that voice. But then you're also working with sovereign nations, you know, so there's 574 sovereign nations in the country. 60% of those, mind you, are living, those sovereign nations are living in California or Alaska. And so there's a lot of sovereign nations just around you where you live, you know. A lot of times they do land acknowledgements. I know that's something that's kind of become popular right now. And that's great. That's good for visibility. I think there's a critical piece to that as well, is that when I hear land acknowledgements, I'm glad, oh yeah, the homelands of Denver, Colorado, or Northern Cheyenne, but it's just kind of like, oh yeah, I want to acknowledge that this laptop belongs to Angelique, but I'm not giving it back. So there's a whole nother narrative on top of that. But I agree with what Corey is saying. I was actually, the last bit I'll include in this. I was fortunate to I worked for a foundation at the time, and I was fortunate to be at the White House when they had one of the kickoff meetings with tribes, with MBK, back when it was its own entity. And so I listened to that. I think there was 11 tribes in that room, around that boardroom, and I listened to what was being said there. At the time, the guys that were over MBKA and leading that initiative, I said, why don't you guys come out to Lame Deer, Montana? You have an invite to come to Lame Deer, Montana and listen. So we brought them out. I think they had 4 people flew into Billings, Montana, and we drove the 100 miles east to go to Lame Deer. We went to a sweat lodge. It's cool just how organic things happen in Lame Deer. We hurry up and grabbed a room at the casino. We went, my friend drove down the street with his pickup truck, and he came back with, I don't know, 8 teenage boys, and we just had like a listening session, and just that quick, that organic and that quick. They learned about our cultural identity. We had an elder come in and kind of talk to them about our ceremonies. They were actually able to go to a sweat lodge. And the reason I say all this is I guarantee you, if we had a conversation with one of them, they would say that this was a paradigm shift for them. This made them view Indian country differently. And it wasn't me writing an essay. It was actually that art of listening to people, of engaging with humanity. And that's, in my experience, that's how hearts and minds are changed. And so I think some of it is, you guys need to come to Indian country, you know, you got to see it yourself. That's the type of engagement that we're looking for.
That connection to people is just part of our culture. It just is who we are. And absolutely, I'm hearing you on that. And also want to give a shout out to Santiago X yesterday, who did the land acknowledgement for Chicago, which is where the main event is happening, acknowledging the land of the Ojibwe, Potawatomi people there. And, you know, just that respect of connecting with the people from that land and being inclusive of them in any time that we're standing on their land. So thank you for that. Eric?
Yeah, I appreciate Sheldon sharing that story. I just, you know, in my last job, we had a similar experience where there's another program that was developed in partnership with President Obama and the White House toward the end of his term, called Fresh Tracks, which was initially it was a similar kind of experience where it was a 2-week opportunity for youth from some Gwich'in communities up in the Yukon to come together, mostly young men, with young men in Compton, California. And what was so, I think, exciting to me about that opportunity is that those young people from Compton got to go up to rural Alaska and to do so many of the things Sheldon was just saying. They spoke to elders. They went to visit the wildlife refuge and traditional hunting grounds up there, had that completely different paradigm shift kind of experience. But our young people, not my people, but our young Native people from those communities got to go down to Compton and learn from their civic leaders and their elders and go to a basketball game. And I think for that whole cohort, there was so much that happened out of it, because I think too often in a lot of these issues, we're dealing with these big structural problems, but we're not realizing that a lot of these young people from different communities that are dealing with juvenile justice and criminal justice don't know that much about each other sometimes, right? So we take it for granted. So the opportunity, I think, for us to build those real, deep, meaningful connections between different communities in this country, and to show who we are as Native people, but for our young Native people to learn about the Black community in South Los Angeles, is so powerful. And so that program actually is still running, and we've trained over 120 youth in other regions of the country, where they're also working on projects together across some of these communities. And so I just think that's so powerful, and it gets back to that experience of really understanding each other's culture too, because I just love seeing young people really take that culture and centering it in their lives in a way that they can really build their own power out of it. So I just really resonate with that story too.
I love it. I love it. And for me, I'm going to invite everybody who is listening in. If you know whose land you are currently standing on, sitting on, the place where you are, put that in the chat. Put it in the chat. If you don't know, I encourage you to look it up. Whose land are you on? And just kind of put that in the chat. But thank you, Eric. Yes, we need to share our stories. We need to invite people to connect. Invite us. We'll be there. We'll show up. Let's get to know each other and really share those stories. When you come to my tribal community, the Flathead Reservation, Northwest Montana, or if you're in Albuquerque, that's where I am. Invite me. I'll be there. Let's share stories and let's connect. So I love it. And that was a perfect segue into the next question. So what does good allyship look like, right, between the Black, Latinx, and tribal communities and other marginalized communities? So what does good allyship look like? So if we can do another round to each of you and just, hear from you.
So to me, allyship is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement and reciprocity, being able to give back and being able to, like Angelique said, and like Sheldon said, we're going to invite you to our parties and you come party, we'll come party with you, you can party with us. That's how we're going to do this. And really being intentional about it. I think there's a lot of times that when we talk about allyship, it's, Native people are here, but then when allyships return to Native communities, it's, oh, Native people are sometimes almost an afterthought. It's, oh, hey, we got this. And then, oh, yeah, we're going to add, yeah, oh, we also have the natives, or, oh, and the indigenous communities. And so when we have that, that's just reinforcing invisibility within communities of color. And so we talk about being able to be equitable and being able to be have equality. It goes back to making sure that if we're going to have this allyship amongst communities of color, we have to be very careful about just adding or othering other communities and being like, oh, okay, at the end of the day, oh, well, we need to add indigenous communities, or, oh, we need to add indigenous voices. If we're not going to be intentional about adding all those voices from the beginning, is that true allyship? Is that true allyship in being able to be respectful and being story ready And again, like, were we really invited to that party, or did everyone else show up and, oh wait, we forgot to invite the Native folks? So really just being intentional about what your allyship is going to look like, being intentional about how you approach it, and not being okay to say you don't know how to do that and asking for help. A lot of times, Native communities are very opening and are very welcoming, but sometimes when you first get there, they might not feel that way because you haven't engaged with them yet. You haven't engaged with those communities yet, and so they may sometimes have to get comfortable with you, and you have to be intentional about that and be intentional going in there and actually creating those relationships and creating that open line of communication. Because if you're going in there and you're just like, okay, again, we're here to do this, and then we're going to leave and you may never hear from us again, that's going to stick with those communities, and those communities are going to remember that. Those communities are going to pass that down, and they're going to be like, oh yeah, you don't want to work with that organization. They tried to, they came in, but then we never heard back from them. So be intentional about what you're doing. Be intentional about where you're going, and intentional how you enter those communities.
Love it, Corey. And I know that Stephen wants to invite us to the party. I see that in the chat, but being intentional, but also that made me think of, it brings it back to President Obama's message, collective leadership, right? Going into those communities and being intentional about connecting to the leaders in that community. So thank you. Sheldon?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thank you. I think Dr. Corey said a lot of really good things there that I won't try to echo, but I agree with everything that he added to that. I think there's been, as far as the historical narrative, and I think it's worth to bring up right now, and I'll quote Vine Deloria here, one of the great American Indian revolutionaries and academics, as he talks about the experience of American Indians versus some of the other groups within the United States, so United States being a systemic racist country from the get-go, legally, that's baked with white supremacy. And so when we look at the experience of American Indians in that, our narrative is a little bit different in the sense that striving for equal rights wasn't something originally our orientation. Our original orientation was, leave us the hell alone, like, we don't want to be part of your guys' games, like, we have our own thing going on here. This is Turtle Island, this is our place, and so this we were forced to become U.S. citizens, actually. So that's 1924. If you look at the history of that, is we were forced to become U.S. citizens. It wasn't on our own volition. And so I think there's a big part about self-determination. There was when we look at the civil rights era, and as far as all the different movements that were going on in the United States at the time, there was an American Indian movement that happened that some of you guys might be familiar with, and that type of engagement. I think for me, looking at the allyship that happened around Standing Rock is moving to me, is moving that we had people from all over the world, literally all over the world, go to Standing Rock, like in the middle of the Dakotas, South and North Dakota, that's moving to me. That's allyship. I think there were some breaks in protocol during that, but I think for the most part, everybody went up there with the full heart. They went up there with love, radical love, to address clean drinking water, to address humanity, some of these basic core human things that we need, water. And I feel like when we center it on those things, I think some of the bridges, both literally and metaphorically, that we need to cross, they'll be easy for us to navigate when we have that at the very core of who we are and the type of engagement that we want to do. So it has to be based within love. It has to be based within respect. Those two things hold hands, right? Respect and love. And so that's the type of engagement that builds allyship. I know for me, I think my life, I have to add this in just because I think it's so cool. At one point, I don't know, basketball's king in Indian country. So I got to go play junior college basketball, and like it was just shocking to me growing up in Indian country where I didn't have very many other brown or black people that lived in the community that I grew up in, but just seeing the similarity of experience that other brown and black people had growing up, you know. So I built allyship. There was a natural thing. Basketball knocked down a lot of. We all love basketball, you know. So we naturally all came together. So if you ever go through Indian country, that's creator's game right there, basketball. So so I think there's a lot of different ways that we can navigate creating allyships and breaking down some of these barriers.
Love it, powerful. When we talk about systemic racism and the federal policies that were put in place, what I'm hearing in the background is, you know, educating ourselves, or what were those federal policies, and really that encourages, you know, I want to encourage other people to think about those things and look into the history of federal Indian law. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Yeah, not much to add on all those great points. Though, when thinking about allyship, to Dr. Still's earlier point that really hit me about being story ready, and particularly thinking about humility. I think what's interesting about Indian country that a lot of people who haven't worked in our communities or built relationships with our communities don't understand is that we're really diverse, right? So even within Indian country, we're hundreds and hundreds of tribal nations and cultures, and it's something that just drives me every day, because it's such a rich set of different communities and unique worldviews and all sorts of different things. And so we, as Native people, have to have our own way of coming into other communities. And I think a lot of people don't realize that sometimes. And for me, one of the most important things is about listening and how you come in and listen in another community. That humility, I think that way that Dr. Still painted the story ready part of it is so critical, because there's so much you have to learn. And I think in any of our communities, you know, you're always on a deep journey of learning. I was born an elder as a kid, quite honestly, because almost any community I go into, I'm in like the elders lounge or, wherever. I'm just automatically drawn to go listen to anyone who's walked before me. And every time I worked with a youth leader who I connected with like that, you could just feel that. And I think a big part of it is that I almost never feel like I'm at a point where I actually have a shared understanding. I think sometimes that's even a complicated place to be in, because I think that's what we're trying to sort of strive for when it comes to allyship. But it's really more of just making sure that the community that you're trying to ally with understands that you truly are listening, that you have that humility, and that you're there, like Sheldon said, with a full heart. I think it was such an interesting example that Sheldon brought up about Standing Rock, because I was out there too, and yeah, there was a lot of like things that made a lot of Native people super uncomfortable about all of these people coming in and breaking protocols. But because of the heart and the intention and so much of the learning going on, it wasn't as if there was this, we knew that people were there in a good way, even if they weren't from our communities. And so I think those are all the kind of nuances to allyship that, I hope everyone, takes to heart. And I think there's a lot you can learn by making sure that you understand not one Native community is exactly the same as another one in any way, shape, or form. We're all very different cultures. So just really appreciate that about our work.
Very, very powerful words, and I'm hearing it and I'm feeling it. Coming into things with an open heart, humility, asking for that humility of others, but also just sharing that knowledge that we do that inside of Indian country. I'm not going to go to, even though Sheldon's in Montana, I'm not going to go onto the Northern Cheyenne Reservation acting like I know everything about their tribal community, right? So just inside of Indian country, there's so much to know. We can't know it all. So just knowing that I go into his community with an open heart and with humility. So I love those messages. And we are going to open it up for questions. Should anyone have any questions for Dr. Still, Sheldon, Eric, please feel free to send those through the chat or just, I'm not sure if we're coming off of the, I think that we can unmic you or open your mic. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free now. I'll just give a moment. And if not, I will move forward with asking the next question, but feel free to put any questions in the chat that you feel come to mind for any of these amazing men. What I would like to do is just ask a question about historical or cultural context. You know, please share how you feel that historical or cultural context may impact tribal communities, and specifically how they show up for this work, right? So when it comes to our work with MBK communities, how do some of those cultural or historical context frame the work that we're doing with MBK? So we'll just do another round with Corey, Sheldon, and Eric.
So I think, as you know, I was kind of looking at that question beforehand, and there was a word in my language that kept popping into my head. There were two words, actually. The first one, skatuki, and the second one, utiyehe. The first one loosely translates to community, but when we directly translate it, it talks more about working together, like working together to build something. And the other one talks about being in balance. And I think, as you know, we talk about how do we, from a cultural context, how do we engage with tribal communities to increase the work of MBK, really is being able to go in and build that allyship together. And knowing that, again, for me, it goes back to what I had said before, understanding that there's a balance, you know, understanding that Native people will come and rally. Native communities will come and rally. It's in our blood. You know, we could look at a historical context and talk about all the great what non-Native communities would call Native uprisings, but what we know as our Native collaborations. You know, you talked about Custard and the Native gathering there that went down. There was a similar gathering for the Southeastern Indians, where the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Creek, we all gathered together and fought. There's that historical context that we show up when we're asked to show up. We will show up to help. Like, I know there have been multiple times where we have been asked, you know, during my undergraduate work, my graduate work, my doctoral work, even in the work that we do now, that, you know, we're asked, hey, you know, we want you all, can you all be there to support us? And we show up. And there's that balance there. So as we think about that, just make sure that when you're asked from Native communities to show up, be there. You know, because it's not just one community over here building something and one community over here building something and one community back here building something. We're all working together to build these communities. And there has to be balance amongst us all. There has to be balance. So take that mindset going in and understand that, you know, sometimes also, I'll be the one to say it, Native people are hard-headed. We're stubborn. You know, and so it might take you a few times to be able to get through to someone. You know, you might not think, oh, that person doesn't like me. They're not laughing at me, or they're not engaging with me. That might be because they're still trying to gauge you. But I'll guarantee you, like again, like Sheldon had said at the beginning, once you engage and truly engage in community with Native people and tribal communities, you know, we will tease you till the end. You know, that's one of the things that we always tell people is, you know, when you're engaged with tribal communities and you're engaged with tribal people, because if you ever come in and we're just nice to you, that's when you know you've done something wrong. But if you come in and we're teasing you and we're laughing at you, or you know, we're joking with you, that's when you know you're a part of our community. That's when you know you've come in and you've come about it in the right way. That's what I always tell my friends and my students. If you ever just came in, I just said hello to you, you better know you've done something wrong, or you need to redefine or rethink what you've done. But so for me, I think those are just kind of some broad perspectives that I could offer.
Thank you. Sheldon?
I think that as far as cultural context, I'll share quickly with you what just happened this morning. Actually, my 12-year-old, I'm dropping him off. Today's his last day of school, and he's asking me, he's like, Dad, what are you doing today? And I said, oh, I'm going to do this thing called My Brother's Keeper. And he asked me, what does that mean? What does that mean? And so, of course, President Barack Obama, he's a poet, and he's amazing with words. He's an orator. So he flipped that, but the biblical context of it is about a brother killing another brother, you know, and it was stated in the negative, you know, I am not my brother's keeper. That's not my job, man, is what was said in the Bible. And I think when I look at it from a Cheyenne perspective, it made me think, I'm like, what it's really about. And I'll tell you the quick Cheyenne story, and this should be made for the silver screen. Honestly, if there's a screenwriter on here, I want to talk to you about making this. as there's a story on the early reservation period at Northern Cheyenne. And if you ever go to Lame Deer, Montana, you do drive down into this little valley. And if you go right into Lame Deer, Montana, going west to east, you'll see a big mountain on the west there. And it has these rocks that mark this trail from the top of this hill all the way to the bottom of this hill. And there's a story about Young Mule and Head Chief. There was two young Cheyenne men, and they were mentors to each other. The one was an older brother they weren't biologically related, but one was an older brother to the other. They showed up for their community. Early reservation period, the cavalry actually stayed on the reservation. There was a fort there with guys with guns that kept us on the reservation. They escaped. They killed a cow, actually. They killed a white person's cow. To make a long story short, they were going to face a firing squad, and they were going to be hung, actually. And the tribal leaders negotiated and said, no, you can't kill Cheyennes like that. They have to die in war. So they negotiated their execution is what they negotiated. And these two young men dressed up in their finest clothes and climbed to the top of that hill and rode headfirst into that cavalry. And so Cheyennes, we show up for each other. We show up and in that story, it's such a beautiful thing because the little guy is the one that was supposed to face the consequences, but they both face the consequences together. It's a terrible story. It really illustrates just the history of forced colonization, genocide. I'm going to throw that word out, the genocide that we face, but yet we still show up. We still show up with love. We still show up. And so I think there's a powerful narrative in that. And so if somebody wants to write that, I'm in for that project. So I think there is a different narrative. There's a different cultural context and how we engage in this work of mentorship and looking out for our younger brothers and looking out for how we take care of one another.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, no, I think these are all great stories, and I think, hopefully give some context. I think another thing that I wanted to raise that I end up talking to a lot of the people that I work with who are outside of our communities too, is to really help them understand all the different places and communities that Native people exist in too, because, in working especially with the youth leaders I did in my last job for many years, these are young people who may have grown up on a reservation in their community, but they're going to college out in an urban area, or they grew up in an urban area with parents who were there, due to the federal relocation program, but still have aunties and others back in a reservation nearby, or they live nowhere near. And there's so many different ways that Native people are moving through these spaces. And so we've developed, a lot of our own kind of cultures that are outside of the cultures that we come from too, based on where we're at. So I think a lot of times it's hard for people who haven't worked in our communities to understand why is it so different when you go out to like a reservation versus an urban Indian center or organization. And there's some things that seem similar and some things that seem deeply different. And it's because of these different kinds of spaces that we have to operate in. And so That's another thing that I encourage those who want to get to know our communities better and work with us, is to learn about as much of our sort of world that we operate in as possible. There's a great network of urban Indian centers across the country. There's all sorts of wonderful organizations at tribes themselves. So depending on where you live, I think part of our invisibility is that a lot of people don't even think they live near Native people. But there's Native people everywhere, and there's a lot to learn from those communities, and a lot of our ancestors who helped continue those struggles and fights in a lot of different places. My family, my great-grandfather actually ran away from his boarding school to Chicago, and that's where our family ended up here in the US originally. My grandfather was a dentist on the Blackfeet Reservation. He was one of the very first American Indian dentists back when termination was happening, when the federal government was ending their relationships with tribes and going back on their treaties. So that's a lot of my story. It's not as connected to my community as possible, but I've been making a real effort to get home as much as I can. So we all have these different kinds of journeys that we're on in relation to one another as Native people, but also with our own communities and cultures, and then with our sort of new cultures and communities that have developed around places like urban communities. So just to give you a little bit more of the complexity for those of you who haven't worked as much with us.
Thank you, Eric. Oh my gosh, this has been such a great panel, and I know we're wrapping it up. We have just a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to just thank you for making those points, really honoring our story, our history, learning about sovereignty, self-determination, and all of those great things that you shared with us. I know we're talking about mayoral leadership this morning, and just understanding our tribal communities aren't structured that way, that we have leaders of tribal nations. And so it's important to not go to those members of the tribal nations or the heads of those tribal nations, but go to their appointees if you want to have a stronger connection at that city level. And then also, talking about, just understanding the different political structures, being story ready, coming with an open heart, sharing that love, and most importantly, inviting us to the party. So, so with that, we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to say gratitude to Michael Smith, President Obama, my brother's keeper, because we are breaking barriers. Thank you for making us visible today. Thank you for having us be here and not invisible. So thank you all, and we will see you at the main stage.